MS. Claire, are you sure you want to erase all memories of Mr. Vaughn on Christmas Eve 7 days from now? I nodded, yes. Unlike hypnosis, memory erasure is permanent. Once erased, it can never be recovered. Are you sure you've thought it through? The staff member's expression was serious, as they confirmed with me again. Yes, I'm sure. I nodded vigorously, my eyes filled with an unprecedented determination. I just want to completely forget everything about Vaughn and never see him again from now on. 1. On the giant electronic screen of InCity's largest commercial plaza, a special interview with Vaughn, CEO of HY Group, was being played. When asked by the host if Vaughn had any unrequited first love, Vaughn looked at me in the audience with tender eyes. He shook the wedding ring on his hand and drew a beautiful arc with the corner of his lips. But I already have it. The audience burst into applause, and everyone looked at me with envious eyes. Even the passers-by who were watching from afar looked at the big screen enviously, sighing that I was so lucky to be able to marry Vaughn, who was talented, handsome, and wealthy. As the protagonist of the incident, I couldn't help but smile wryly. From school uniforms to wedding dresses, Vaughn and I have been together for 10 years. Our wedding was luxurious and grand, with more than a dozen helicopters circling above the wedding venue, constantly pouring petals onto the ground. The whole city knew that Vaughn doted on his wife and regarded me as his life. In a car accident years ago, Vaughn broke 6 ribs to save me. He also swore to heaven that he would never let me down in this life. The oath seemed to be ringing in my ears, but the one who made the oath seemed to have forgotten. A month ago, a stranger added me on social media, and I learned that Vaughn actually had an 18-line starlet outside. That little starlet was named Daphne, and she had been with Vaughn for 2 full years. Every time Vaughn lied to me before, saying that there was something wrong with the company, he actually went to her. It was only then that I realized that Vaughn had divided his love into 2 parts, one for me and one for Daphne. Whatever I had, Daphne had too. On all holidays, the gifts Vaughn prepared were the same 2 copies. And even on my birthday, Vaughn sent her a 520 red envelope. It's ridiculous that I've been so immersed in my self-deceived happiness all this time. And now I finally know that people's hearts are changeable and true and false are hard to tell. The surrounding exclamations and envy continued, but I was no longer in the mood to listen. With a bitter smile, I turned and left. When I got home, I printed out the divorce agreement I had drafted. Vaughn didn't come back until nearly midnight. He tiptoed into the bedroom, but unexpectedly, I was leaning on the head of the bed playing with my phone. "Why aren't you asleep yet? Didn't I tell you not to wait for me?" Vaughn's voice was soft, as if he was blaming a disobedient child. I've always had trouble sleeping and had headaches. Once I didn't get enough sleep, I would definitely have a headache the next day. So very early on, Vaughn told me that if he worked overtime or had a dinner party and came back late, I should go to sleep first and not wait for him. But I've long been used to waiting for him and falling asleep in his arms. I stared at Vaughn intently. His eyes were deep, and the tenderness in them was almost impossible to melt. I really couldn't understand how he could say he loved me while betraying me at the same time. "What's wrong?" Vaughn seemed to notice something and asked me softly. I shook my head gently. "Nothing," Vaughn said apologetically. "Sorry, I had a lot of work to do at the company today. I will definitely come back earlier next time." I know Vaughn was lying, because just a few minutes ago, Daphne had sent me a few photos. In the photos, she and Vaughn were kissing passionately in the room, and their used condoms and tissues were scattered on the ground. This was the first time I had seen such a distraught Vaughn. "I think you've never seen Vaughn like this. After all, Vaughn complained to me that you were boring and dull in bed, and there was no difference between you and a dead fish." I could feel Daphne's disdain and mockery for me through the screen. 2. I didn't expose Vaughn's lie. Gripping my phone a little tighter, I tried to force a nonchalant smile. "Okay." Vaughn didn't notice my strangeness and secretly breathed a sigh of relief when I lowered my head. As usual, Vaughn reached into the covers, feeling my ice-cold feet, and habitually wanted to warm them in his palms as he always did. However, as he approached, the strong scent of gardenia on Vaughn made me feel nauseous, and I couldn't help but retch. Vaughn was startled, Baby, what's wrong with you? Are you feeling unwell anywhere? The anxiety and worry in his eyes seemed genuine, and he said he would take me to the hospital for an examination no matter what. Vaughn lifted the covers and got out of bed, starting to change his clothes in front of me. However, when he took off his shirt, my pupils couldn't help but shrink. There were several obvious finger marks on Vaughn's back, and I thought they must have been left by Daphne when she was passionate. What's that? I pointed at Vaughn's back and asked knowingly. Vaughn didn't understand, turned to the mirror, and his face changed when he saw the finger marks. Panic flashed in his eyes. Oh, I scratched it. I don't know what's wrong these days, my back itches badly. Vaughn's voice trembled, and he carefully observed my expression while speaking. I lowered my eyes, my heart aching like suffocation. I don't know when my marriage with Vaughn became full of lies. I'm stupid but not stupid. At that position, at that angle, how could I possibly scratch it myself? I nodded, indicating that I understood, and still didn't expose his lame excuse. Seeing his relieved expression, I silently calculated the time to leave in my heart. In 7 days, Vaughn and I would go our separate ways. After a thorough examination, it was confirmed that I had no problems. When I heard the doctor say that I was fine and not suffering from gastritis, Vaughn obviously relaxed. But when he heard that I was not pregnant either, there was an undisguised disappointment in Vaughn's eyes. After 10 years of love, if there was any regret in our happy life, it would be that Vaughn and I had never been able to conceive a new life to carry on our bloodline. For this, we made a lot of efforts, but the results were always unsatisfactory. Now it seems that this may be the will of heaven. Since the two of us are destined to separate, it is actually a good thing to have no children. In fact, I have had this kind of nausea and vomiting recently. When I went shopping and saw beautiful underwear or sexy stockings, I couldn't help but think of the scenes of Vaughn and Daphne together, and I couldn't help but feel nauseous and vomit constantly in my mind. I went to see a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said it was a stress response to being cheated on, and there was no medicine to treat it, so I could only adjust myself. After a lot of tossing and turning in the hospital, it was already dawn when I came out. Just about to get in the car and go home, Vaughn's phone dinged with a social software message. I don't know what was said inside, but Vaughn's face changed suddenly. Baby, the company suddenly has an urgent matter to deal with. I'll let the driver send you home. Without waiting for my answer, he got into the assistant's car and left in a hurry, and the car disappeared completely from my sight in less than 3 seconds. But I knew he wasn't going to the company, but to find Daphne. I didn't let the driver send me, but found an excuse to let him go first. I took a taxi on the roadside and followed Vaughn until the car stopped in front of a familiar villa. As soon as the car stopped, a petite figure ran out of the door. 3. Honey. Daphne's voice was soft and sweet, with a slight upward inflection at the end captivating. Vaughn caught Daphne, who jumped into his arms with a smile, pretending to be annoyed. Be careful, you're so old, why are you still so reckless? Daphne hung all over Vaughn, and she put her arms around Vaughn's neck and coquettishly said, I miss you. Hearing this, Vaughn seemed to be in a particularly good mood, and he reached out and pinched Daphne's nose. Little goblin, I came here as soon as I received your message. I really thought something happened to you. Daphne giggled. Vaughn carried Daphne into the house like that. This villa was a birthday present from Vaughn, because I love the sea, and this place is right next to the sea. Every morning when I wake up, I don't need to go out. I just need to open the bedroom curtains, and I can see the vast sea. But I didn't expect Vaughn to use the villa. He gave me to hide his mistress. Soon, 2 blurry intertwined figures appeared at the window of the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. Vaughn kissed Daphne passionately, but Daphne's gaze went straight through the gap in the curtains to where I was, her eyes triumphant. I knew it wasn't my illusion. She knew I was there. Miss, do you want to get out of the car? The driver couldn't help but look at me sympathetically. No. I shook my head with a bitter smile and told the driver to turn the car around. When I got home, I took the opportunity to start packing when Vaughn was away. The jewelry Vaughn gave me, the clothes bags and shoes Vaughn gave me, our wedding photos, including the wedding ring that Vaughn personally designed and customized. I packed everything related to Vaughn into a huge cardboard box and prepared to throw it all away. When Vaughn came back, I was almost done packing. "Baby, look what I brought you. Your favorite almond biscuits." Vaughn offered me the almond biscuits in his hand like a treasure, with a look of anticipation for my praise. But he seemed to have forgotten that I was allergic to almonds and couldn't eat almond biscuits. It was probably someone else who loved almond biscuits. I stared at Vaughn fixedly, my heart aching faintly. Before, when the maid at home didn't know I was allergic to almonds, I accidentally ate a pastry containing almonds. My whole body swelled up, and I almost suffocated. At that time, Vaughn was so scared that he was terrified. From then on, he repeatedly ordered that nothing related to almonds could appear in the house. At that time, I still laughed at him for overreacting. Now, looking at the almond biscuits in front of me, I only felt ironic. Seeing that I didn't take it, and didn't show the joy he expected, Vaughn asked curiously, "What's wrong? Isn't this your favorite?" I said indifferently, "I don't like it." "How could that be? I clearly remember that you used to love almond biscuits the most." Vaughn frowned, seemingly puzzled. "I'm allergic to almonds. I don't eat almond biscuits." "Are you sure it's me who likes to eat almond biscuits?" I looked at Vaughn calmly with a calm voice. Vaughn's hand holding the almond biscuits paused, but he quickly covered his lips with his other hand and coughed to hide his guilty conscience. Not daring to look at me, Vaughn turned his head and happened to see the cardboard box on the ground and quickly changed the subject. "What's this?" I perfunctorily replied, "It's nothing. It's just some old stuff I don't want. I'm going to donate it to a poor mountain area." Seeing that I didn't dwell on the matter of the almond biscuits, Vaughn obviously breathed a sigh of relief. So when I took out the divorce agreement and asked him to sign on the last page, Vaughn signed his name without even looking at it. You know what you're signing, right? Aren't you afraid I'll sell you out?" I said jokingly on purpose. You know, people like Vaughn, who are worth over 100 million, are most afraid of signing blindly. Every signature of theirs is crucial, so they are extra cautious. However, at this time, all of Vaughn's attention was focused on his phone. I don't know what he saw, but his eyes deepened and his desire became stronger. Vaughn smiled lightly, not caring. "What else could it be? Didn't you just say you wanted to donate supplies to the impoverished mountainous areas?" "I agree, you can decide on these matters." "Baby, the company has urgent matters to deal with again. You eat first, don't wait for me." After saying that, Vaughn gently kissed my cheek and left impatiently. Looking at Vaughn's departing back, I lowered my eyelashes. I don't know since when, the time I spent with Vaughn has become less and less. He is getting busier and busier, but whether he is busy with work or with his lover, probably only Vaughn himself knows best. At this time, my phone received a photo sent by Daphne. In the photo, she was wearing a sexy black lace lingerie. Her posture was enchanting, and her eyes were seductive. "Claire, I know you saw it last time. Vaughn is on his way to see me now. Look, I don't even need to speak, just one photo, and he will leave you without hesitation. You are so pathetic." I smiled bitterly in my heart. So Vaughn deceived me again. It turned out that Daphne had unknowingly occupied most of Vaughn's mind. But it doesn't matter. I can be completely free in one more day. On New Year's Eve, I thought of having our last New Year's Eve dinner with Vaughn as our farewell dinner. However, as soon as I sat down, Vaughn's phone rang. Vaughn promised me that he would only accompany me today. So he hung up the phone and pretended nothing had happened. However, a few minutes later, a social software message came into his phone. Seeing the content of the social software, Vaughn's face changed drastically, and he suddenly stood up and said to me apologetically, "I'm sorry, baby. The company has a very urgent matter to deal with. You eat first, I'll be right back." "What's so important? It's New Year's Eve. Can't you finish dinner before you go?" This was the first and last time I asked him, and it was also the last chance I gave him. Unfortunately, Vaughn didn't cherish it. He refused without hesitation. "Baby, it really won't work. I've already arranged the fireworks show. I'll come back and watch the fireworks with you when I'm done." Ignoring my dim eyes, Vaughn finished speaking without the slightest hesitation and left impatiently. After Vaughn left, I received another provocation from Daphne. "Happy New Year. Send you a New Year's gift. Below is a pregnancy test report. Patient named Daphne, pregnant for 5 weeks. It turns out that Daphne is pregnant. No wonder Vaughn, who has always been calm and composed, would leave so anxiously. I know Vaughn won't be back tonight. He has always wanted a child. And now he has finally got his wish. So naturally he wants to be with Daphne. And besides, I think Daphne will definitely do everything she can to keep Vaughn. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, Vaughn called me panting, saying that something was very tricky, and he probably couldn't solve it for a while. So he couldn't accompany me to watch the fireworks. I responded indifferently and asked him to work at ease. After hanging up the phone, I put my phone, divorce agreement, and wedding ring on the coffee table, and left the house where I had lived for nearly 10 years with a suitcase I had prepared long ago. Halfway through the car ride, fireworks lit up the sky outside the window, and my name and Vaughn's name flickered in the air, with a huge heart in the middle. The taxi driver looked out the window and exclaimed, "The CEO of HY Group really loves his wife." Hearing this, I just smiled and didn't respond. There is no doubt that Vaughn loves me, but that doesn't prevent his body from cheating on other women. I lay on the operating table, with chips connected to various instruments all over my body, and everything was ready. I closed my eyes slowly. "You can start." "Goodbye, Vaughn." On the other side, Vaughn, who had been with Daphne all the time, suddenly felt a dull pain in his chest and was restless, as if something important was about to be lost. 5. Vaughn became increasingly panicked and called me, but the phone went unanswered. All the servants in the house had already gone on vacation, and he drove home regardless of Daphne's obstruction. Vaughn called my name as soon as he entered the door, but he couldn't find me anywhere in the villa. Not only that, but all the things related to me in the house were gone, as if I had never existed. Returning to the living room in a daze, Vaughn immediately saw the few things I left on the coffee table. The big words "divorce agreement" were so eye-catching that for a moment, Vaughn's mind went blank. Vaughn's eyes were red, and he tremblingly picked it up and turned to the last page. His pupils suddenly constricted, and he looked at his name in disbelief. Vaughn had no impression of ever signing a divorce agreement. The only document he had signed recently was the donation agreement I had given him. Vaughn finally realized that it was not a donation agreement at all, but clearly this divorce agreement. Next to the divorce agreement was the phone I had been using. The password of my phone has always been our wedding anniversary, and Vaughn unlocked it easily. The wallpaper of my phone has always been a photo of me and Vaughn, but now it has been replaced by the system's default picture, and all the photos and videos in the album have been deleted. Opening the social software, the interface stopped directly at the dialog box between me and Daphne. His fingers trembled, and he swiped up little by little. After reading all the messages Daphne sent me, Vaughn collapsed on the ground in despair, his face pale and bloodless. Only then did he realize that I had known about his affair with Daphne for a long time. It turned out that Daphne had been secretly sending me photos and videos to provoke me all the time. No wonder I even left my favorite wedding ring. The wedding ring I and Vaughn wore was designed by Vaughn himself. When separated, they were ordinary women's rings and men's rings. However, the patterns on the two rings combined to form a heart shape, with the initials of my name and Vaughn's name engraved inside. I never took it off after I put it on. If it weren't for the phone I left behind, Vaughn would probably have thought that he was hiding it very well. In Vaughn's subconscious mind, he and I would definitely grow old together. So he never thought that one day I would leave so decisively. Vaughn's eyes were bloodshot, and he kept shaking his head, repeating my name over and over again. "Claire, Claire." "President Vaughn, there's news about Mrs. Vaughn." The assistant ran in with the phone. Hearing this, Vaughn suddenly stood up, grabbed the assistant's collar, and asked urgently, "Where is Claire now?" "The last place Mrs. Vaughn appeared was at the airport." The assistant replied cautiously. "What are you waiting for? Prepare the car, go to the airport." Vaughn's face lit up with joy, and as he spoke, he walked towards the car outside. After a few steps, he realized that the assistant had not followed. "Why aren't you following?" Vaughn scolded displeasedly. "That President Vaughn." The assistant hesitated. Vaughn suddenly had a bad feeling. 6. Under Vaughn's intense gaze, the assistant continued with difficulty. I've checked the passenger lists of all flights that have taken off, and those that haven't taken off today, and Mrs. Vaughn's name isn't on any of them. How is that possible? Vaughn didn't believe it. It's true, President Vaughn. I checked the airport surveillance and confirmed that Mrs. Vaughn never came out after she went in. A cold sweat broke out on the assistant's forehead. No one knew where I had gone. I just disappeared without a trace. Find her. Send everyone out to find her. I don't believe a living person can disappear into thin air. Vaughn stumbled, almost falling to the ground. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. In the blink of an eye, I had been gone for a month. Vaughn's hair turned white overnight, and everyone was praising his infatuation. He didn't leave the house every day, and he didn't care about the company's affairs. Besides listening to his subordinates report the progress of finding me regularly, he just drank. The empty wine bottles in the house had piled up like a mountain, and there was no place to set foot. As a result of excessive drinking, Vaughn suffered from a stomach bleed. It was only when the assistant went to his house to find him that he discovered something was wrong with Vaughn and sent him to the hospital in time. As soon as Vaughn woke up, he was slapped hard by his mother, who had rushed over. Are you going to lose both your life and your company for a woman? Do you know that the board is already very dissatisfied with you now, and they have been putting pressure on your father to remove you from the position of CEO? Vaughn's mother was so angry that she couldn't bear it, but Vaughn still looked like a hopeless and decadent man, ignoring his mother's words. How could I have such an unpromising son as you? Seeing this, Vaughn's mother stomped her foot angrily and left. At this time, the assistant came in quickly with his phone in hand. A sudden light flashed in Vaughn's dead eyes. Is there news about Claire? The assistant shook his head and said with difficulty, President Vaughn, it's Miss Daphne. She couldn't get through to you. And she couldn't see you either, so she had to call me. Hearing the name Daphne, Vaughn seemed to suddenly think of something, and he struggled to sit up from the bed. Daphne, right? I almost forgot about her. Tell her, I'll go find her. Vaughn's eyes seemed to be covered with a layer of ice when he spoke, and the assistant couldn't help but tremble. And Daphne, who received the news that Vaughn was coming to find her, didn't know what kind of pain and torture awaited her. Daphne deliberately put on a delicate makeup and changed into a sexy suspender dress before Vaughn arrived. When Vaughn came in, Daphne's eyes were red, and she said aggrievedly, Honey, you're finally here. Daphne flew towards Vaughn like a butterfly, but this time Vaughn didn't reach out to catch her as usual. Vaughn slightly turned sideways and Daphne stumbled, falling heavily to the ground. Honey, it hurts. Daphne's voice choked. Her eyes were red, and her tears were about to fall but not fall. If it were in the past, Vaughn would have certainly held Daphne up with heartache. However, this time, Vaughn turned a blind eye to the hand Daphne extended and ignored her aggrieved voice. Daphne finally discovered the coldness in Vaughn's eyes at this moment. Her heart skipped a beat, and Daphne was a little panicked. Vaughn was like Satan from hell, exuding a dangerous aura, approaching Daphne little by little. 7. Daphne backed away as Vaughn approached, until her back touched the hard wall, with nowhere else to go. Honey, what's wrong with you? Daphne swallowed nervously. She was really scared now, and her voice trembled. Vaughn grabbed Daphne's neck fiercely, his voice cold. I remember I warned you to know your place. The position of Mrs. Vaughn will always belong to Claire, but you actually ignored my words. Who gave you the courage to talk nonsense in front of Claire? Huh? Vaughn's grip was very strong, and Daphne struggled painfully. You hurt me. Her throat was tightly choked. Daphne's face was flushed. She was almost suffocating, and she managed to squeeze out a few words. However, Vaughn didn't soften his heart, and his strength increased. It's you, this vicious woman, who drove my Claire away. At this moment, Vaughn seemed to have lost his reason, and it was the assistant who stepped forward to persuade him when he saw that Daphne was in a bad condition. Vaughn then let go of Daphne with a flick of his wrist. I just love you too much. I'm jealous that Claire can get all your love, and I also want to stand by your side openly. Besides, I'm already pregnant with your child, and I don't want my child to be labeled as a bastard as soon as he is born." Daphne knelt on the ground, hugged Vaughn's thigh tightly, and cried bitterly, complaining about her grievances. She thought that mentioning the child would soften Vaughn's heart, but unexpectedly, Vaughn was even angrier. "Is it because I've been too good to you recently that you've forgotten what kind of thing you are? Do you think you can be compared to my Claire? Don't you want people to laugh at your child? That's easy. I'll have someone take you to the hospital to abort it now." There was no warmth in Vaughn's eyes when he spoke, and Daphne knew he wasn't joking. No, Vaughn, how can you be so heartless? He's your own flesh and blood." Daphne cried heartrendingly. However, Vaughn just raised his chin slightly and motioned for the bodyguard to take her away. "Vaughn, you'll regret it." Until the car drove away, Daphne's hysterical roar still echoed in Vaughn's ears. Regret? Vaughn smiled bitterly. He had regretted it long ago. He clearly had a stable happiness, but he was greedy for the momentary freshness and excitement, and it was his fault that he lost his Claire. Tears of regret flowed from Vaughn's eyes. 8. While Vaughn was regretting his past actions here, I had already changed my identity and moved to City B. Vaughn only knew that I had grown up with my elderly grandmother since I was young, but he never knew that I was actually the youngest daughter of the Eden family in City B, and I had always used my mother's surname. Because of my poor health and inability to adapt to the climate of City B, I was sent to live with my grandmother since I was young. The Eden family is the head of the 4 major families in City B, with both strength and influence. With the Eden family protecting me, Vaughn naturally couldn't find any trace of me. When I returned to the Eden family, I changed back to my father's surname and started a new life. To make up for the years of neglect, my parents and brother wanted to give me all the best things. 3 years passed in a flash. I was getting engaged, and my fiancé was the second young master of the Upton family, one of the other 4 major families. Upton, the second young master of the Upton family, was second to none in terms of appearance and character, and his reputation was also very good. He was carefully selected for me by my parents. Upton knew that I had been married once, but he didn't mind and still firmly chose to get engaged to me. In his words, "Who hasn't been blind and foolish when they were young?" Regarding my marriage, my family explained that I had suffered a serious illness and forgot many things. But I clearly remember everything, except that I have no memory of my ex-husband or anything about him. But I think since we broke up, we couldn't have loved each other very much, so I didn't dwell on the past too much. The marriage of 2 families belonging to the 4 major families of City B became the headline news of the media. In the past 3 years, Vaughn has not had a smooth journey. Because of his previous self-indulgence, many shareholders of the company lost confidence in him, and he was almost kicked out of the company. It was only with his father's sacrifice of faith that he barely saved his position. Vaughn had to work harder than before to regain the trust of the shareholders. But he also never gave up searching for me. The moment he saw my photo in the news, Vaughn couldn't believe his eyes. After all, he had been disappointed too many times in the past 3 years. However, this time, although it was just a blurry side profile, Vaughn had a strong intuition that this was me. "Book me a flight to City B immediately, the sooner the better." Vaughn ordered his assistant to book a ticket while sitting in the car, and telling the driver to drive to the airport. On the way, Vaughn felt his heart pounding, both excited and afraid, and he could only relieve his tension by constantly urging the driver to drive faster. When Vaughn arrived, the engagement ceremony between me and Upton was already more than halfway through, and it was just time to exchange rings. There was a commotion outside. "Claire." I seemed to hear someone calling my name. 9. Upton, my parents, and my brother all changed their expressions slightly, and they looked at their subordinates at the same time. The subordinates who received the eye signals quickly walked out. Soon, the commotion outside subsided, and everything returned to normal. The engagement ceremony was successfully completed, and I felt that everyone except me was obviously relieved. Only I was inexplicably confused. I walked out of the hotel with Upton's arm, and unexpectedly, Vaughn suddenly rushed out from somewhere. Vaughn's hair was disheveled, and 2 buttons of his suit were undone, looking extremely disheveled, as if he had just been through a fight. Claire, you can't marry him. Vaughn's eyes were red, and he was emotionally agitated. As he spoke, he tried to rush over and grab me. Upton subconsciously blocked me behind him, and the bodyguards around him gathered around to guard against Vaughn. And I looked at the young man with white hair in front of me with only one thought. This man is so strange. Sir, do we know each other? How do you know my name? This sentence was like a dull thunderclap on Vaughn's heart, and his face turned pale as snow in an instant. Claire, this joke is not funny at all. Vaughn thought I was still angry with him, and was deliberately pretending to have amnesia. He didn't know that I really didn't recognize him now. I shook my head. I'm not joking, I really don't remember knowing you. My expression was serious and my eyes were clear. Claire, I know I was wrong. You can punish me however you want, just don't deny me. Vaughn's face was already pale and almost transparent, his eyes pleading. Seeing Vaughn's painful appearance, my heart ached inexplicably, and I couldn't help but groan. Upton keenly noticed my abnormality. President Vaughn, my fiancée has already made it very clear. She doesn't know you. So please leave and don't disturb us anymore. Upton's voice was not loud, but the warning was very strong. Seeing me leave with Upton, Vaughn wanted to continue to entangle, but he was stopped by Upton's bodyguards. Looking at my back as I left with Upton, Vaughn felt both pain and unwillingness. I didn't take Vaughn's matter to heart. Unexpectedly, a few days later, I met him again at the gate of Upton's house. I couldn't help but frown slightly. I don't understand what this person wants to do. Vaughn should have been waiting for me for a long time, and his skin was flushed red by the cold wind. Vaughn looked even worse than before at this moment. His face was haggard, his eyes were dim, and his whole person seemed to have lost his energy. Coupled with his already white hair, he seemed to be at least 10 years older. 10. After returning that day, Vaughn instructed his assistant to investigate my current identity and find out what had happened to me. Why did I forget him? Unexpectedly, the assistant really found some clues. I had a headache, and the only side effect after erasing my memory was that the headache became more severe. So after returning to City B, I would go to a private clinic for regular medication every month. Money can make the devil grind. The assistant bought off a nurse at the clinic at a high price and got my medical records. When Vaughn saw the words erasing memory, his eyes widened suddenly, and then his whole body trembled, almost unable to stand. How disappointed must he have been to know that I still chose to erase all memories related to him despite knowing the side effects. How resolute must I have been to abandon all my past and start a new life with a new identity. Despair flooded Vaughn like a tide. Vaughn tore his hair in pain. Poof, he spat out a mouthful of blood, rolled his eyes, and passed out. The first thing Vaughn did when he woke up in the hospital was to run to Upton's house. He desperately wanted to see me and wanted to express his guilt and regret to me. However, when I really saw me, my calm and indifferent eyes were like knives that cut his heart. Claire. Vaughn's eyes were full of regret, and as soon as he opened his mouth, his throat choked up. It seemed that there were thousands of words in front of him, but now he could only barely call my name and couldn't say another word. I frowned, thinking to myself that this man was really strange. I don't know why, but I felt a deep sense of despair from Vaughn. Later, I never saw Vaughn again. It was just that every year on my birthday, I would receive a bouquet of yellow roses symbolizing apology. The next time I heard about him was 2 years later, when I had already married Upton. Vaughn was stabbed in the street, and the one who stabbed him was none other than his former lover, Daphne. At that time, Vaughn resented Daphne for provoking me in front of me, so he had someone take Daphne to the hospital for an abortion and also removed Daphne's uterus, depriving her of the right to be a mother. Not only that, he also sent Daphne abroad and sent people to monitor her, not allowing her to return to China. Daphne's life abroad was worse than death, and she was so painful that she finally saw through Vaughn's cruelty. A few days ago, Daphne finally found an opportunity to escape surveillance and sneak back to China. And the first thing Daphne did when she returned to China was to seek revenge on Vaughn. Daphne was taken away by the police for intentional injury, and Vaughn was in a coma due to his serious injuries. One was a former small-time 18th line star. and the other was a deeply affectionate president who had turned white overnight for love. One man and one woman. It was either murder or a love killing. Therefore, the past between Daphne and Vaughn was quickly dug up by various media. Vaughn's affectionate husband persona collapsed, and many business partners chose to terminate their cooperation with HY Group, and the company's stock price even fell to the limit at one point. My parents and brother were whispering, and when they saw me and Upton coming over, they closed their mouths in unison and pretended nothing had happened. Seeing their evasive and cautious appearance, I wanted to laugh. In fact, when Vaughn came to find me for the last time, I had a vague understanding of something. However, since everyone chose to keep their mouths shut and not mention it in front of me, I didn't need to take the initiative to ask. Everything in the past is a prologue. Since I forgot, it must not be important. Now that the ones I love and the ones who love me are all by my side, it's enough.